From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The 2024 election is 3 weeks away, and where does it stand? Has Kamala Harris's progress stalled? And is Donald Trump ahead in the battleground states? What about the House and the Senate? We'll break down the horse race 3 weeks out and whether you should simply ignore the polls for the rest of this campaign for the sake of your sanity. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, Wall Street Journal opinion page editor, and I'm here with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. So let's take stock here of where we stand in the horse race, presidential and the Real Clear Politics polling average. Kamala Harris leads Donald Trump narrowly, 48.9% to 47.2%. That's in the composite of all recent polls. But in the 7 main battleground states that just about everybody says will determine the winner, Donald Trump leads in 6 in the Real Clear averages, albeit narrowly. The exception, Wisconsin, where Harris leads by 0.3%, which is essentially a tie, as the others are all a tie as well, as they are 1 percentage point or less advantage for Trump in those battlegrounds. The race, in short, in those polling surveys is essentially tied. Nonetheless, this wouldn't be an election campaign without spin, so both campaigns issued dueling interpretations of where the race stands over the weekend, claiming they have the advantage. The Trump campaign was particularly aggressive in doing so, Kim issuing a memo basically saying that Kamala Harris's progress has stalled, conceding she had made progress since she entered the race and rose through July, but saying no progress to speak of for her in August or September, despite the fact that some polls did show that progress, particularly after the debate with Donald Trump. But now they say it's turned back towards Trump. That's where the momentum is, and they'll win. And David Plouffe, who's working for Kamala Harris, he was one of the gurus behind Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. He says, no, sorry, Trump has a ceiling that is lower than Kamala Harris's, which is one of the reasons she has the advantage. So sort this out for us, Kim.
So both sides are obviously trying to take advantage. We're in the final 3 weeks, and so they want momentum on their side. They want to gin up their voters. That's all understandable. If you look out there at what's going on, there doesn't seem to be any denying that Trump has had some better polling in the past week. And one theory behind this, and what Democrats are certainly concerned about, is that if you look back since Kamala Harris got into this race, she's had a series of bumps. She had a bump when she announced. She had another one when the Democratic convention came on. She had another one legitimately after that debate, in which I think you could certainly say she performed better than Donald Trump. With each of these, you've had a sustained media vibe around her that I think has helped her. She doesn't have that going on at the moment, and there are no more events in the foreseeable future. And so the Trump campaign is suggesting that it's creeping back up in the polls, that it's seizing the final advantage. I think there's 2 ways to look at these polls. Some Republicans look at the Real Clear Politics average and they say, well, look, Trump is even or ahead in these. That means he's won, because look at 2016 and 2020, where he was well behind the Democrats in those cycles and still either won or almost won, just barely lost. And this time he's looking much better. I think there's a different way to look at it, which is that I think there's a possibility the polls are getting it more right this time, and that what we have is truly a race that is on the knife's edge in every one of these swing states. And that, I think, could make for a very nail-biting election day or election couple weeks afterward, if we really do have close races and we're waiting for mail-in ballots, et cetera.
You're an optimist saying it's only going to be a couple of weeks. But my question for you is, why do you think that the polls might be more correct this time?
So if you dig into some of them, one of the things that we know polling did wrong last time is they underestimated, or they didn't pay enough attention, I should say, to the share of the vote that Donald Trump was getting. All they cared about was who was ahead and by how much, rather than looking at those numbers to say, is Donald Trump really in these polls getting what we would expect him to get in the end, which is close to 50% of the vote. If you look at some of the polls now, they seem to be capturing that vote total. Meaning if you look at Michigan, you would expect him to get 47, 48% of the vote. You would expect her to get somewhere in there. He seems to be much more in that target range in a lot of these polls, which suggests to me that maybe the polls are doing a slightly better job.
Yeah, that's interesting because it suggests that the polls are capturing that Trump vote. And even David Plouffe says that Trump is going to have to motivate voters who normally don't turn out. And maybe those votes are being captured. And therefore, his ceiling is, he's at his ceiling, and he's not going to get over 48, 49% in most of these states. And I guess the question is, has his ceiling moved up at all from the past, Kyle? And I mean, I don't know what you think. My own view is that I don't think it has very much. I think he is, I mean, even though he's doing better, certainly he's doing better with Black men. He's doing better with Hispanics. He's doing somewhat better among younger voters than he did in 2020 in particular. But he may be doing worse with white women, particularly white women in the suburbs. And those people vote. And maybe that is going to be ultimately what saves Kamala Harris. What do you think about that Trump ceiling issue?
I think it's a real problem for him because he does seem to be running a Trump rally strategy of throwing out these kinds of applause lines, these kinds of policy proposals, tax-free tips and so forth that make the crowds go wild when he says them at his rallies, but that are polarizing. It seems like a strategy intended to get out the vote, get out his base, rather than to persuade these undecideds. Two other things that I would add to this conversation about this knife's edge election in the polling. The first one is that undecided share is still significant. If you look at the most recent Wall Street Journal poll in Arizona, so Harris is up by 2, but 6% are undecided. And the figures for undecided voters are slightly higher in Georgia and Nevada, slightly lower than that in some of the other states, Michigan and North Carolina. But there are voters who will make up their minds in the last days and weeks before Election Day. One of the reasons that the polling was incorrect and undercounted Trump voters in 2016 is that if you look at the exit polls, he won those late decided voters. And so I think that that's another unpredictable factor that is hard to get into just an analysis of the polls. And then the second one would be this get out the vote operation question. There's a University of Florida election lab tracker of early votes. And as of right now, it says there have been 4.5 million votes cast, including 3.7 million mail ballots. And a couple dozen states, it looks like, have party registration data. And Democrats have voted about 1 million votes so far. Republicans, less than 600,000. So that's a pretty good gap. And how will the Trump operation be? How good will they be at making that up on Election Day? And is it going to be raining in Philadelphia, just to pick one city? I think that's part of what makes this really hard to forecast.
Well, I mean, on that mail-in point, though, I mean, the Democrats always do better in early voting. I mean, they did it last time. And I don't think that early voting data so far is definitive enough to say whether or not Republicans have cut into the huge advantage that Democrats had in 2020, in particular, in the mail-in vote. But if you look at party registration numbers in the last 4 years, and particularly in the last few months, they would give the edge to Republicans, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, where the partisan advantage is still Democrat +4, but it used to be +10. So this is a significant move towards the Republicans. But I think I agree more with your point about the turnout operation, because the Democratic Party is focused on turnout here as a party. And of course, so are some of their affiliated groups. And I think they tend to do very well there. What I think the Trump campaign may be at a disadvantage is that they are subcontracting out their turnout to Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk. And that is a real wild card because they haven't done this before. And that's generally young people who, let's be honest, may decide to sleep in on the crucial period of this election campaign.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you can find news stories now in the weeks leading to the election where the Harris campaign or sources close to it are bragging about how they have 2,500 staff, 350 offices. Last week, they knocked on 600,000 doors, made 3 million calls, 63,000 volunteer shifts. And that stuff can move the needle and get people who, some of whom are maybe represented in the polling and some of whom maybe are not, off their couches and to the polls on election day or to the website where they were going to request or fill out a mail ballot application. And you can see the Trump response is that they have hundreds of staff, but they are relying on these organizations, including this Turning Point Action Group, also a super PAC affiliated with Elon Musk. And there's some advantages to that kind of outsourcing strategy, but there are real challenges to it as well. And so I think it remains to be seen whether it will be able to match the Harris get out the vote drive in the way that you used to have Republican and Democratic campaign staffs going head to head in that task.
Kim, what do you think?
Well, to your point about Democrats having a great get out the vote operation, if you want to know why Joe Biden refused to intercede in that dock strike that went on, it's because they absolutely rely 100% on organized labor to do the bulk of this work. And they weren't going to do anything to rock that boat. Another reason to believe that they will have a very well-oiled machine again this fall. This point about outsourcing, this isn't just Turning Point Action. That this is a one caveat I would note. They're not just targeting young voters. I know Turning Point Action is about younger Americans, but what they're doing is they're going to these bright red districts in swing states, places where Donald Trump tends to run up the margin, and they are going through the voter rolls and finding voters that haven't voted in the last election or last two elections, what they call low propensity voters. And in theory, that is electoral gold if you can find those people and if you can get them to go vote. It's all those ands that are the big question in ifs, because they're called low propensity voters for a reason, because they don't tend to show up. So this is a really huge bet Republicans are making this year. It's part of a Trump strategy. He believes that there's a lot of forgotten voters, and if you can get them engaged, it's a huge advantage for the GOP. Will it work? I think it's going to be one of the fascinating mysteries of this election.